The small town of Hollow Creek stood in eerie silence as the journalist and his team drove through its narrow, winding streets. This was a place forgotten by time, its few inhabitants living like shadows, reluctant to speak and avoiding eye contact whenever possible. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, as if the town itself was holding its breath. They had arrived to investigate a string of strange disappearances over the past few decades, a mystery that had left law enforcement stumped. The townspeople muttered only whispers about these disappearances, with a particular focus on a family known as the Cartwrights. The Cartwrights had once run a guest house, known for its luxurious offerings, but now that same house was said to be hiding a dark and terrible secret. The journalist, a seasoned investigator, was used to probing into mysteries, but there was something different about Hollow Creek. The locals' refusal to discuss the Cartwrights or their house only piqued his curiosity further. He spent the afternoon interviewing townsfolk, but each conversation ended abruptly, with uneasy glances and awkward silences. One elderly man who had lived in Hollow Creek his entire life trembled as he recalled the Cartwrights. "They were different," he said, his voice a mere whisper. "They welcomed everyone with open arms, but no one ever really left, not in the way they came." His words trailed off into a soft murmur, leaving the journalist with a growing sense of unease. Later, the journalist visited the now abandoned Cartwright estate. The grand house, once a symbol of elegance, now stood in eerie disrepair. Despite its decaying exterior, the journalist could sense that something lingered in the walls. Something alive, something that didn't belong. He asked around town about the history of the family, and the stories he heard painted a picture of charm and grace. The Cartwrights had been known for their impeccable hospitality, their guest house a haven for travelers seeking comfort. But then the disappearances began, and the family slowly faded into the shadows of town folklore. The townspeople, however, remained tight-lipped, their eyes darkening when the name Cartwright was mentioned. The journalist's curiosity grew with every passing moment. He returned to the town's diner and asked the waitress about the guest house. Her hand shook as she refilled his coffee. "I'm not saying it's true," she began, her voice barely audible, "but I heard that some of the guests never left the house, not in the way they were meant to." The cryptic words left the journalist pondering the implications. He knew something terrible had happened in this town, but the truth remained just out of reach, hidden beneath a veil of silence. No one dared speak of it aloud, and yet the town was suffocating in its own buried secrets. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, the journalist returned to his car, his mind racing with theories. The Cartwrights' guest house, once a place of refuge, now seemed like a place of unspoken horrors. He sat in the car, flipping through his notes, trying to make sense of the contradictions he'd encountered. There were too many questions, too many inconsistencies, and the deeper he dug, the more the town seemed to close in around him. Hollow Creek was a place where something ancient and terrible lurked, its secrets buried beneath layers of time and fear. And the Cartwrights, once the picture of hospitality, were at the center of it all. Just as the last light of day faded, the journalist received an anonymous letter slipped under his car door. His heart skipped a beat as he unfolded the yellowed paper, the strange symbols and cryptic phrases immediately sending a chill down his spine. The letter warned him to leave Hollow Creek before it was too late, urging him to stop asking questions about the Cartwrights and their guest house. The handwriting was erratic, barely legible, but the message was clear. They offer hospitality, but it comes with a price. Leave now before you become the next guest. The symbols on the paper appeared foreign, almost ancient, their meaning lost in time. But one thing was certain, the writer knew something the journalist was desperate to uncover. The journalist's mind raced as he tried to process the contents of the letter. Was this a warning from someone who had managed to escape the Cartwrights' clutches, or was it simply another attempt to deter him from digging further? As the evening grew darker, a sense of dread settled over him. Hollow Creek was not a place to uncover the truth. It was a place to be consumed by its secrets. The words on the letter haunted him, the cryptic message echoing in his head. He had come for answers, but now, with the sun setting behind him and the letter in his hands, he wasn't so sure he wanted to know what those answers might be. The journalist's instinct screamed at him to leave, to turn back and never look back at Hollow Creek. But his curiosity, as always, pushed him forward, deeper into the heart of darkness. As he stared at the letter one last time, a cold breeze swept through the empty streets, carrying with it the faint whispers of something sinister. The Cartwrights' hospitality had always come with a price, and now it seemed that the time had come for him to pay it. But what kind of price? And what had happened to all those who had disappeared? He felt his resolve harden. There was no turning back now. He had to see this mystery through, no matter what it cost him. As the last traces of daylight faded into night, the journalist tucked the letter into his coat pocket and headed back to his rented room. The words still burned in his mind. "Leave now before you become the next guest." The town seemed eerily silent, the only sound the echo of his footsteps in the darkening streets. Hollow Creek had its secrets, and he was determined to uncover them, no matter how dark they might be. But as the door of his room clicked shut behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. The Cartwright family estate loomed on the outskirts of Hollow Creek, a once grand manor now succumbing to the passage of time. Its towering structure was a haunting reminder of a bygone era, decaying wood, crumbling stone, and ivy creeping up the sides like a disease. As the journalist and his team approached the estate, a sense of dread settled over them. The house, though abandoned for decades, seemed alive with a silent energy. They stood at the gates, looking up at the windows where faded curtains billowed as if someone was still watching. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of the secrets that had been kept behind those walls for so long. The journalist could feel it. The house was hiding something, and he was about to uncover it. When they finally entered, they were greeted by the last living member of the Cartwright family, an elderly woman with sharp, knowing eyes that seemed to pierce through them. She introduced herself simply as Mrs. Cartwright, her voice smooth but unsettling. Her demeanor was calm, almost too calm, like a woman who had lived in the shadows of time and knew things others couldn't begin to understand. She welcomed the group inside, her brittle hands beckoning them to follow her as she began a tour of the estate. The team exchanged nervous glances, sensing that every step deeper into the manor would bring them closer to the heart of its mysteries. They had come to investigate, but what they were about to discover was far darker than they could have imagined. As they walked through the grand halls of the house, the journalist and his team couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The rooms were filled with heavy, antique furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, dust coating every surface, but strangely, no signs of decay. The walls were adorned with faded photographs, some of which seemed strangely out of place. The faces of the guests in the photos were frozen in smiles, but their eyes were unsettling, hollow, almost like they weren't quite human. As they moved deeper into the house, the symbols etched into the walls began to draw their attention. At first, they seemed like ordinary decorative carvings, but the further they went, the more they seemed to shift, as if the symbols were alive, twisting and changing as they moved through the house. Each symbol felt more foreboding than the last. Mrs. Cartwright spoke little during the tour, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she were speaking to herself rather than to them. Every time she gestured to a new room or passageway, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, pulling the team further into the manor's dark embrace. The walls, covered in what appeared to be intricate carvings, seemed to pulse with energy. The journalist's pulse quickened as he took note of one particularly striking symbol, a serpent coiled around an eye, its edges sharp and menacing. As they reached the library, the team couldn't help but notice the overwhelming silence that enveloped the space. It was as if the house had swallowed all sound, leaving only the creaking of old wood beneath their feet and the quiet breathing of the Cartwright matriarch. Every step they took felt like a step closer to something far worse than they had imagined. The journalist's eyes scanned the room, noting the collection of old books lining the shelves. Something about the atmosphere was oppressive, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. It was then that he noticed a narrow door tucked away behind a heavy velvet curtain. It seemed to be out of place, hidden from view, as though it had been deliberately concealed. Without saying a word to the others, he quietly moved toward it, his curiosity overpowering any sense of caution. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a set of steep stairs leading down into a dark, musty basement. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the journalist descended slowly, careful not to disturb anything. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a small room filled with old, weathered journals. He pulled one from the shelf, its leather cover cracked with age, and flipped it open. The writing inside was faded but legible, and what he read sent a chill down his spine. The patriarch of the Cartwright family, in his own words, described a special guest service he provided, one that promised a permanent stay for those who truly wished to become part of the family. The chilling implication of his words hung in the air like a curse, and the journalist realized too late that his investigation had just crossed a terrifying threshold. The more the team delved into the history of the Cartwright family, the darker the truth became. They pored over old journals, town records, and even newspaper clippings from decades ago, piecing together a chilling narrative. The Cartwrights had once been admired for their charm and hospitality, but the records painted a very different picture. The family had been involved in practices far beyond mere superstition. What had initially appeared to be a quaint guest house was, in fact, a front for something much darker. Behind the polished doors and welcoming smiles, they were performing rituals, secret forbidden ceremonies meant to appease an ancient entity that resided deep beneath their estate. The more they uncovered, the more the house itself seemed to pulse with an eerie, malevolent energy. The rituals, it seemed, were not only about power or wealth, they were sacrifices. Every decade, the Cartwrights would select new guests to honor by offering them to the entity beneath the house. The special guest service they had once promised was not hospitality, it was a ritualistic offering. The guests would never leave, not as they came anyway. Instead, they would become part of the estate's dark history, their souls claimed by the ancient force bound to the land. The team found references to ceremonial rites that took place in the dead of night, when the stars were hidden behind dark clouds and the air was thick with incantations. The house, with its grand walls and ancient furniture, served as a silent witness to these horrifying events. The family had grown more obsessed with the ritual over the years. What had begun as a way to secure their wealth and fortune had morphed into something far more insidious. The Cartwrights no longer saw their guests as people, but as offerings, mere pawns in a centuries-old game they were unable to escape. Over time, the family members became more reclusive, their behavior more erratic. Neighbors reported strange occurrences, unexplained lights in the windows, shadowy figures in the yard, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Those who were brave enough to stay near the estate at night spoke of a constant hum in the air, like a low chant, barely audible, but always present. The Cartwrights' hospitality was a facade that hid a monstrous obsession with appeasing the entity they had bound themselves to. The more the team learned, the more they realized that the entire town of Hollow Creek was complicit in the family's rituals. Many of the locals, afraid to speak out, had turned a blind eye to the disappearances. After all, the Cartwrights had provided for the town. They had money, influence, and a reputation for kindness. But now, the journalist could see the truth that had been buried for so long. Hollow Creek was not just a town that had forgotten the Cartwrights' crimes. It was a town that had allowed them to continue. As the team dug deeper into the town's history, they discovered that the Cartwrights weren't the only ones involved. There had been a network of people, perhaps even other families, who had helped cover up the disappearances, shielding the Cartwrights from any real consequences. With each new piece of evidence, the journalist's unease grew. It became clear that the house itself was far more than a mere building. It was an anchor for the entity, its walls steeped in blood, and its foundations built on the sacrifice of innocence. The deeper they dug, the more the house seemed to react. Unexplained chills ran through the journalist's body as he stood in the estate's study, the place where the patriarch had penned his final journal entries. It was as if the house itself was aware of their investigation, subtly pushing them closer to a discovery they may not survive. He couldn't help but wonder, if the rituals had continued for so long, how many guests had been claimed by the entity? How many souls were bound to the estate, lost forever? The journalist's team was growing more nervous as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. They had uncovered enough to know the Cartwright family's dark secret, but they were now questioning their own safety. The spirits of those who had been sacrificed were restless, their presence palpable in the air, and the team could feel them watching from the shadows. Even the town itself seemed to exude a sense of impending doom, as if the journalist and his team were being watched by unseen eyes, by those who had long since disappeared into the estate's dark legacy. As the journalist turned back to the pages of the patriarch's journal, his hand trembled. There was more to uncover, but what would they do once the truth was revealed? Would they be able to leave, or would they become the next offerings? Unable to resist the urge to continue, one of the team members ventured outside to explore the woods surrounding the estate. The dense forest was rumored to contain a hidden cemetery where the bodies of those claimed by the Cartwrights were buried. But it was more than just a graveyard. It was the final resting place for the souls that had been lost to the house's dark past. The team member, despite warnings, made their way deeper into the woods, determined to uncover the truth. However, the forest was not as it seemed. As the journalist stood at the edge of the estate, watching his team member disappear into the trees, he heard a faint whisper, a low voice, calling from somewhere deep within the woods. He strained his ears, hearing nothing but a distant, almost ethereal scream that seemed to echo from every direction. When he looked again, his team member was gone, swallowed by the darkened trees. There was no sign of them, just the rustling of leaves and the oppressive weight of the silence. The journalist couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, that it was aware of his presence, watching him from every creaking floorboard and every shadowed corner. As night settled in, he decided to stay in the manor, hoping that by spending the night, he might uncover more of the dark history that lurked within its walls. The team had left for the evening, but something kept him there, a gnawing curiosity mixed with a sense of dread he couldn't ignore. The house seemed to grow colder as the hours passed, and the sounds, soft, ethereal noises, began to invade his senses. At first, it was just the faintest of footsteps, echoing from the floors above. Then came whispers, low and unintelligible, filling the rooms with a sense of unease. As the hours dragged on, the noises grew more pronounced, more aggressive. The air around him felt thick, as if it were pushing against him, heavy with the weight of something ancient. The floorboards creaked under unseen feet. The walls seemed to groan, as though bearing the weight of countless secrets, and the feeling of being watched intensified with every passing minute. No matter where he went in the manor, the sensation remained. He was never truly alone. The shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of his vision, and sometimes, when he turned quickly, he could have sworn he saw faces in the dark. His skin prickled as an oppressive energy settled over him, almost as though the house itself were feeding on his fear. Determined to understand the source of these feelings, the journalist and his team ventured outside to the graveyard behind the manor. The air was thick with fog, making it difficult to see the rows of crumbling headstones that lined the area. The earth was uneven, and many of the graves were unmarked, their stones worn down by time. As they dug, they uncovered something far worse than they had anticipated. Unmarked graves filled with bones, some of which appeared disturbingly fresh, as if the earth had only recently claimed the bodies. The team moved cautiously, the overwhelming stench of decay hanging in the air as they uncovered a stone altar buried under layers of dirt and moss. The altar, ancient and covered in bloodstains that had never washed away, seemed to hum with an unsettling energy. The markings on the stone were incomprehensible, but they were unmistakably tied to the rituals the Cartwright family had performed. The atmosphere in the graveyard was stifling, the very ground beneath them seemingly alive with the memories of those buried there. The team was visibly shaken, their breaths shallow, eyes darting nervously at the shadows that seemed to move just out of reach. As they stepped back from the altar, an eerie silence fell over the graveyard, and for the first time, the journalist felt a strange, suffocating pressure in the air. The voices that had whispered from the house now seemed to echo from the ground itself, seeping from the very earth around them. The faint sounds of weeping and muffled cries drifted on the wind, and the team could feel the temperature drop sharply. It was as if the spirits of the past were reaching up from the graves, their souls restless, bound to the land by the rituals that had been performed on their behalf. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a figure, pale, translucent, and barely discernible at first, but then clearer, a woman with hollow eyes and a twisted expression, standing in one of the windows above. Her face was pale, almost sickly, her features gaunt, as if drained of life itself. The journalist's heart skipped a beat as the ghostly figure pressed her face to the window, staring directly at him. He backed away, his pulse racing, but as he turned, he saw another figure standing in the shadows of the yard, and another in the corner of the room through the manor's broken windows. They were everywhere, these spirits, their forms flickering like fading light, their eyes fixed on him, their presence undeniable. The feeling of being watched became too much to bear. It was as if the spirits were not just lingering, they were hungry. The team continued to investigate the manor, each step taking them deeper into the house's haunted history. But as they moved from room to room, the ghostly figures began to appear more frequently, manifesting in the shadows, in the corners of the rooms, and in the reflection of mirrors. At first, they were fleeting glimpses, nothing more than a flicker of movement, a change in the air. But soon, they became more solid, their faces twisted in expressions of pain, torment, and silent pleading. The temperature dropped even further, and the walls themselves seemed to shudder as if the house were alive, reacting to their presence. The journalist's breath fogged in the air as he moved through the halls, each turn bringing him closer to the heart of the manor's terrifying secrets. At the edge of the study, the journalist's attention was drawn to a faint whisper that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. He froze, straining to hear, but the whisper turned into a voice, a low, guttural voice, rasping and filled with ancient sorrow. "Leave," it said, its tone demanding, almost desperate. The journalist turned quickly, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to linger, echoing in his mind. And then came again, this time louder, more forceful. "Leave now or join us forever." The journalist's blood ran cold as the air around him thickened with an unseen presence. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, as though it were being held in place by some unseen force. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the figure of a man, pale and worn, emerged from the shadows. His eyes were hollow, and his smile twisted into something grotesque as he spoke again, his voice a rasping whisper, "You will never leave." As the spirit faded into the air, a deep, ominous silence followed. The temperature plummeted even further, and the journalist could feel the cold seeping into his bones. His heart pounded in his chest, his body frozen in terror. He knew now that this was no longer just an investigation. It was a fight for his life. The spirits, bound to the estate, would not let him go. He had crossed a line, and the house, the spirits, and the Cartwrights themselves were all part of an ancient, unbroken cycle that had claimed countless souls before him. The spirit's warning echoed in his ears, and with it came the sickening realization that if he didn't leave the manor before dawn, he would be added to the list of lost souls, joining them forever. The journalist's mind raced as he walked through the dark halls of the manor, the weight of the discovery bearing down on him. His footsteps echoed in the silence, and the chilling whispers of the spirit seemed to grow louder with each passing second. He knew he had to confront the Cartwright matriarch. She was the last person alive who could provide him with the truth that had eluded everyone for so long. When he finally found her, sitting in her rocking chair by the fire, her frail body barely moving, he demanded answers. The air in the room felt thick with anticipation, and as she turned to face him, her eyes glinted with something far older, something ancient. She didn't speak at first, just staring at him, but the silence between them was enough to confirm that she knew exactly what he was after. With a deep, raspy sigh, the matriarch began to speak, her voice slow but deliberate. She told him the story of the Cartwright family, a story that began with kindness and goodwill. They were once known throughout the region for their generosity, their hospitality extending to all who came to stay at their estate. The family had been well respected, their guest house a symbol of comfort and warmth. But everything changed when the family discovered something buried beneath their home, a relic, an artifact of unimaginable power. The matriarch spoke of it in hushed tones, as if fearing the very words themselves. It was an ancient object, one that had been buried long before the Cartwrights had even arrived at the estate, hidden deep within the earth. When they unearthed the relic, the family's fortunes changed overnight. Wealth, influence, and power flowed into their lives in ways that seemed almost magical. The artifact granted them everything they could have ever wanted: land, respect, endless prosperity. But with the power came a terrible price, one they couldn't have foreseen. The relic wasn't just a source of wealth, it was a cursed object, bound to an entity beneath the estate, a malevolent force that demanded tribute in exchange for the power it bestowed. The family, in their greed, had unknowingly made a pact, and the price for their newfound riches was the lives of innocent guests who came to stay at their home. It was not just a sacrifice, it was a feeding ritual, one that sustained the entity and in turn kept the Cartwright family's power alive. The matriarch paused, her eyes distant, as if reliving the horrors she had witnessed. She spoke of the family's descent into darkness. Over the years, as the Cartwrights grew more obsessed with maintaining their wealth and control, their hunger for more power only grew stronger. The rituals became more frequent, the offerings more brutal. The entity beneath the estate began to take hold of their minds, twisting their desires and corrupting their souls. They were no longer human, at least not in the way they had once been. The family became monsters, empty shells of the people they had once been, driven solely by the need to feed the entity and secure their dominance. Each new generation of Cartwrights fell deeper into the curse, losing their humanity piece by piece, until they became little more than puppets, controlled by the very force they had unleashed. The journalist listened, his heart pounding in his chest, as the matriarch described the horrors the family had committed, the countless lives they had stolen to keep their empire intact. She spoke with a sense of resignation, as if she knew that the family's fate had been sealed long ago. There was no escaping the curse, no redemption for the Cartwrights. The entity beneath the estate had grown too strong, its grip on the family too tight. They were trapped, bound to the land and to the ancient power they had disturbed. The matriarch's voice trembled as she explained how she and the other Cartwrights had slowly lost their ability to feel, to empathize. They had become monsters, slaves to the very power they had sought to control. When the matriarch finished her tale, the journalist stood there in stunned silence. The weight of what he had just heard crushed him. He had expected darkness, but not like this. The family he had once seen as merely strange had been twisted by something far worse than human greed. They had become puppets, their lives ruled by an entity that had consumed them from the inside out. And the horrors didn't end with the matriarch. She wasn't the last Cartwright. There were others hidden away within the walls of the house, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The matriarch's eyes shifted to the walls behind her, and she smiled a wicked, knowing smile. "They are waiting," she whispered. "The others, they never left. They are waiting for the right time to come back. And when they do, the cycle will begin again." The journalist felt a chill run down his spine. He had already seen the ghosts in the windows, the figures watching from the shadows, but this was something far worse. The Cartwrights were not just spirits, not just victims of their own greed. They were something else now, something beyond human comprehension, bound to the estate, to the entity beneath it. And worse still, they were not the only ones. The matriarch's revelation sent a wave of terror through him. He had uncovered the family's true nature, but now he realized he had no idea what he was dealing with. The real horror was only just beginning. As the matriarch's words echoed in his mind, the journalist felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. He looked around the room, but the shadows seemed to deepen, the walls pressing in around him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Cartwrights were watching him, waiting. The house itself seemed to pulse with a dark, oppressive energy, as if it were alive, feeding off his fear. He had come to uncover the truth, but now he feared it might be too late. The curse of the Cartwrights had spread far beyond the family itself. It had become a part of Hollow Creek, a part of the land itself, and there was no escaping it. As the matriarch's chilling words hung in the air, the journalist realized that he was not the hunter anymore. He was the hunted. The journalist's heart raced as he and the remaining members of the team made their way through the manor, desperately seeking an exit. The air around them felt suffocating, the walls groaning as though the house itself was alive, aware of their presence. The team had uncovered the truth about the Cartwrights, the ancient relic, and the curse that had bound the family to the land, but they hadn't anticipated the full horror of what lay beneath. As they moved deeper into the manor, the temperature dropped, and the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from the shadows. It wasn't just the house that was alive, it was the spirits of the past guests, reanimated and twisted by the dark entity that controlled them. Before they could react, the air seemed to shift, and the team was ambushed. The past guests, once innocent victims, now emerged from the darkness, their bodies grotesque and deformed, their eyes hollow, their faces frozen in expressions of rage and agony. The spirits were no longer the whispering apparitions they had encountered earlier. They were physical now, their once human forms contorted into nightmarish versions of their former selves. The journalist watched in horror as one of the spirits lunged toward them, its skeletal hands reaching out with unnatural speed. The team fought back, but it was clear that these were no ordinary ghosts. They were vessels for the entity beneath the house, bound to do its bidding, and there was no escaping them. The manor, once a grand estate, now seemed like a prison, its very walls closing in on them. The spirits of the past guests swarmed, their movements jerky and unnatural, their voices distorted with vengeful cries. Every corner of the house seemed to be alive with the presence of those who had been trapped here, forced into eternal servitude by the curse. The team backed into a corner, fighting off the reanimated bodies, but it was clear they were outnumbered. The journalist could feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, as if it were alive, feeding off their fear and desperation. The entity beneath the ground was awake now, its power growing stronger with each passing second. As the team struggled to fend off the vengeful spirits, the very walls of the manor seemed to shift, narrowing their escape routes, closing off exits they hadn't noticed before. The house had become a labyrinth, its structure warping and twisting with the malevolent force that lived inside it. Every step they took felt like a step further into the heart of the curse, deeper into the entity's grasp. The journalist's breath came in ragged gasps as he turned to his team members, their faces pale with terror. They had uncovered the Cartwrights' dark secret, but now the full extent of the curse had been unleashed. They weren't just in a haunted house. They were trapped, caught in a web woven by an ancient force that had no intention of letting them leave. Desperation set in as the team scrambled to find a way out, but the house seemed to shift again, making escape impossible. One of the team members screamed as they were pulled into the darkness by an unseen force. The journalist's heart skipped a beat as he watched them disappear into the floor, dragged beneath the house with terrifying speed. The sound of their screams echoed in the distance, but it was quickly drowned out by the low hum of the entity, growing louder as it fed off their fear. The walls trembled, and the ground seemed to quake beneath their feet. The house was alive, and it was no longer just a place. It was a prison, a tomb for those who dared to enter, a place where the curse held dominion. The journalist stumbled backward, his mind reeling with the horrifying realization. The curse was real, and if he didn't escape now, he too would be trapped within the house's history, another lost soul bound to serve the entity. Panic surged through him as he realized they were running out of time. The spirits were closing in, the walls were tightening, and the entity's power was becoming overwhelming. He could feel the darkness pressing in on him, suffocating him. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned to the remaining team members, urging them to move faster, but the air around them was thick with dread. The journalist knew that if they didn't leave now, they would never leave at all. The manor had claimed its next victims, and they were running out of time. The journalist's heart raced as he sprinted down the hall, the sound of slamming doors echoing in his ears. The house had turned against them. What had once seemed like a grand, decaying manor was now a living, breathing entity, one that was actively hunting them, trapping them in its labyrinthine corridors. With every step they took, the house seemed to shift, the walls narrowing, the floors groaning beneath their weight. Windows shattered without warning, sending glass shards flying, and the air grew thick with an unnatural chill. The spirits of the past guests screamed in unison, their voices rising in a cacophony of agony and rage that filled the air. The house was alive, and it was determined to keep them within its clutches. In a desperate bid for survival, the journalist and the remaining team member pushed through the corridors, trying to find a way out. But it was hopeless. Every door they opened slammed shut behind them with a force that shook the foundation of the house. The entity's power was growing stronger with each passing minute, feeding off their fear, growing more solid, more malevolent. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, watching them from every angle, and every room they entered felt like a dead end. They were trapped, and the walls were closing in. The journalist's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he realized the full extent of their situation. They weren't just trapped in the house, they were being hunted by it. The two of them stumbled through the mansion, moving deeper into its heart, drawn by a strange pull. Something in the back of the journalist's mind told him that there was a place within the house where the source of the entity's power lay, a place where the curse had begun, and perhaps a way to end it. As they rounded a corner, he caught sight of a door that seemed to call to him, its handle twisted and ancient. He pushed it open with trembling hands, and they entered the innermost chamber of the manor. The room was unlike anything they had seen before. The air was thick with dark energy, and at the center of the room, on a pedestal, lay an ancient book. The journalist's eyes widened as he stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the key to ending the nightmare. The book was old, its pages yellowed with age, and its cover bound in what looked like leather, stained with something dark and ancient. The journalist's hand shook as he carefully opened it, desperate for answers. As his eyes scanned the pages, he realized the book contained instructions that could destroy the curse and banish the entity. But there was one problem. The language was unfamiliar to him. A twisted, ancient script that he couldn't decipher. Panic surged through him as he flipped through the pages, trying to make sense of the symbols, but it was no use. The words blurred before his eyes, mocking him with their indecipherable form. He needed help, but the time was running out. The walls of the room began to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy, and the temperature dropped even further. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, forming shapes that looked like twisted, disfigured faces. The spirits of the past guests Their hollow eyes watching from the walls let out a collective scream that vibrated through the very bones of the house. The entity was near. The journalist could feel its presence closing in on him. His desperation grew as he realized that without the ability to read the book, he was powerless to stop what was coming. The curse was too strong, and the house had already decided their fate. Just as the journalist felt the weight of hopelessness settle over him, the room grew even colder, and the shadows seemed to take shape. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form tall and imposing. The journalist's blood ran cold as the figure stepped forward, its face twisted in a grotesque, spectral grin. It was the patriarch of the Cartwright family, but not as the journalist had seen him in photos. This figure was not a man. It was a twisted, decayed version of the patriarch, his skin stretched tight over his bones, his eyes black voids filled with malice. His form flickered, his body shifting between solidity and translucence, as though he were caught between this world and the next. The patriarch's eyes locked onto the journalist, and a low, guttural voice rumbled from his throat. "You think you can end this?" he hissed, his voice echoing with centuries of torment. "This is our home. You cannot destroy what is already dead." The journalist stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest as the figure took a step forward, his hollow eyes boring into him. The shadows seemed to swell around them, pressing in from all sides. The air grew thick with dread, and the spirit of the patriarch reached out, his bony hand stretching toward the journalist. The curse had awakened fully now, and the house, the spirits, and the entity were all closing in, ready to claim their next victim. The journalist could feel the crushing weight of the patriarch's presence, his form like a suffocating shadow. He tried to move, to run, but his legs were frozen in place, as if the very air around him was holding him down. The book was still in his hands, but it felt useless now. The words had blurred into nothingness, and all hope seemed lost. He could hear the other spirits closing in, their whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. The patriarch's grin widened as he stepped closer, his voice echoing in the journalist's mind. "You should have left when you had the chance," he sneered. "Now you belong to us." The room began to spin, and the walls seemed to collapse inward, the house itself devouring everything in its path. The final hour had arrived. The journalist, facing a desperate choice, must either sacrifice himself to destroy the entity beneath the manor or escape, leaving the curse to continue. As the house trembles and the spirits of the past scream, he makes the ultimate decision to sacrifice himself, knowing it will destroy the house and end the curse. With a final, determined step toward the ancient book, the ground shakes violently and the house begins to collapse around him. As the walls crumble, a twisted laughter echoes through the ruins, but then everything goes silent. The curse is broken, the manor is reduced to rubble, and Hollow Creek is left in eerie stillness, its dark legacy finally ended at a terrible cost.